Hey guys, tonight we dive into the wild, chaotic, slightly ridiculous world of Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who made short kings look like underachievers. Picture this: Corsica, 1769, a tiny island full of goats, cliffs, and people who could probably bench press your entire town without breaking a sweat. And in this picturesque chaos, a baby named Napoleon arrived, tiny, loud, and already judging everyone. Most people wouldn't survive this world, but apparently he thought, challenge accepted. He grew up with a mop of dark hair, a sharp nose that seemed designed for dramatic poses, and an ego that was basically Corsica-sized itself. School wasn't so much about learning as it was about realizing you could be better than everyone else, even if you tripped over your own shoes, and Napoleon excelled at being annoying in ways that somehow impressed teachers. Because, let's be honest, being annoying with style is a talent. His family, minor nobility, with more attitude than actual wealth, threw him into military schooling in mainland France, probably thinking, maybe this will get him out of our hair for a while, not realizing that was like giving a kid a sparkler in a fireworks factory. From the start, he was competitive, not in a friendly game of chess way, but in a I will literally outmaneuver, outsmart, and outglam everyone way, which is peak Napoleon energy. He had an early obsession with maps and strategy, which is adorable until you remember he would later use that obsession to ruin hundreds of thousands of lives. But hey, early interests, am I right? Corsica itself was in political turmoil, which is probably the best environment for brewing a future dictator. Constant gossip, alliances forming and collapsing faster than TikTok trends, and everyone yelling at each other with extra hand gestures for dramatic effect. Young Napoleon soaked it all in, like a sponge but with sharper teeth, and started imagining himself as the guy history books would whisper about centuries later. He wasn't tall, which was apparently a thing people still make jokes about, but he compensated with sheer ambition and, let's be real, a knack for making everyone around him feel like tiny peasants. Friends and enemies alike quickly learned that underestimating him was a skill issue, because he had the audacity to think a Corsican kid could eventually bend Europe to his whims. By the time he hit adolescence, he was already scribbling tactical notes, arguing with teachers, and charming a few people while terrifying others, which is basically the starter pack for a future emperor. Imagine the audacity. Tiny island kid, probably still stepping on goat droppings, fantasizing about commanding armies across continents. Man, history was wild. And in case you're wondering, yes, he had moments of genuine charm that made you forget you were about to be ruined by him one day. But mostly, it was just Napoleon being Napoleon, ambitious, dramatic, and slightly terrifying. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Comment your location and local time, 'cause I'm nosy. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Napoleon's teenage years were basically a crash course in how to look smarter than everyone else, while secretly being a tiny rage machine. And honestly, it was a masterclass in flexing without social media. At the military academy in Brienne-le-Château, he quickly realized that being short, Corsican, and a little awkward made him the perfect target for insults, which he turned into fuel because apparently humiliation was just seasoning for his future empire. He studied mathematics, artillery, and all things explosive, which is cute because he later used that knowledge to literally blow up entire cities. But again, baby steps. Teachers who tried to intimidate him mostly failed. He either stared them down or argued with such precision that they wondered if the kid had secretly downloaded the entire French military manual into his brain overnight. He had a habit of writing long letters home, complaining about everything from the food to his classmates' stupidity, which is peak teen energy, but somehow these letters also revealed a mind-calculating campaigns decades ahead. Napoleon also learned the value of presentation, walking into rooms with an intense glare, perfect posture, and dramatic pauses that made everyone else look like confused pigeons. Basically, the OG influencer move, but with less Instagram and more threat of actual violence. His obsession with artillery wasn't just nerdy. He genuinely loved the idea of using numbers, angles, and timing to wreck stuff, which, if you think about it, is both terrifying and slightly impressive. He started winning minor exercises and mock battles, proving that being a little annoying and highly obsessed could get you noticed, and noticed he got by tutors, superiors, and eventually people who had actual power. Despite all this, he struggled with some basic social skills, which meant he made enemies as easily as he made plans, because apparently, being a genius also comes with a free trial of arrogance and mood swings. Friends of his later recalled he had a magnetic personality. He could charm, intimidate, or bore people into submission, sometimes all in the same conversation. He also discovered the joy of dramatic self-narratives, imagining himself as a larger-than-life figure, which is funny because that would literally become his life goal. Make history remember him like he starred in a non-stop action movie. By the time he graduated, he wasn't just a competent artillery officer. He was a Corsican storm in a French uniform, ready to outmaneuver, outwit, and out-annoy everyone in his path. And man, if anyone doubted him back then, they were about to get schooled in the harshest way possible. History doesn't care about feelings, only results. So yes, the foundations of Napoleon's military swagger, strategic obsession, and borderline insane confidence were already baked in, like a cake nobody asked for, but everyone would eventually taste whether they liked it or not. Napoleon didn't just stumble into the French Revolution. He practically surfed its chaotic, bloody waves like it was a theme park ride made entirely of guillotines and bad decisions. France, in the 1790s, was a mess, royalty getting beheaded, mobs yelling slogans nobody fully understood, and every street corner offering free drama for anyone willing to duck and dodge. Most people probably hid under their beds, but Napoleon, he saw opportunity, and not the subtle kind. We're talking full-blown, I will ride this chaos like it owes me money energy. He joined the Revolutionary Army, where uniforms were mismatched, morale was questionable, and discipline was about as consistent as a Wi-Fi signal in a storm, and somehow he thrived. He scored his first big wins in artillery campaigns, proving that math, maps, and a flair for intimidation could make him indispensable. His reputation as a young, ambitious officer who could command respect and fear spread fast, which, if we're being honest, is basically the 18th century version of going viral on TikTok. The irony, of course, was that while he was praised as a hero, he was also notorious for being impossibly strict, barking orders that left subordinates simultaneously terrified and grudgingly impressed. His rise during this period wasn't just about skill, it was about understanding human nature, which he exploited shamelessly. He learned to make allies, manipulate rivals, and look effortlessly confident even when his own side was on the verge of panic, which is peak Napoleon energy. Chaos is just a backdrop for self-promotion. Of course, there were plenty of skeptics, people muttering that a Corsican kid couldn't possibly understand France, let alone control anything. But history tends to side with people who get results and have zero chill, and Napoleon fit that bill perfectly. He also began crafting his personal mythology during this period, subtly encouraging the idea that he was not merely a soldier, but a prodigy destined to remake the world. Little gestures, like striking poses for miniatures, dictating letters in a dramatic tone, or making sure everyone knew exactly how brilliant he was, were all part of the early brand building that would later pay off in empire-sized dividends. Meanwhile, The revolution continued its relentless spiral, with factions betraying each other faster than a streaming drama plot twist, and Napoleon simply navigated the madness like a pro gamer who read the cheat codes in advance. He became the go-to guy for complicated missions no one else wanted, which was convenient because he genuinely liked the thrill of risk and the taste of adrenaline. It was like seasoning for his already overinflated ego. By the end of this whirlwind, Napoleon had transformed from a minor military nerd into France's favorite, unpredictable, ambitious, slightly terrifying wunderkind, proving that, sometimes, thriving in total chaos is less about luck and more about sheer nerve. And honestly, who could blame him? If history handed you this much drama, you'd flex too. By the time Napoleon hit his mid-20s, subtlety was clearly not in his vocabulary, because he decided to stage a coup like casually rearranging furniture in someone else's house, except the furniture was an entire government, and the neighbors were all armed. The political situation in France was messy, to say the least. The Directory was a weak, corrupt joke, public trust was basically non-existent, and factions were throwing shade like it was an Olympic sport. Napoleon saw all this and thought, sounds like the perfect time to be dramatically ambitious, which is peak him energy. The 1799 coup, known later as the coup of 18 Brumaire, wasn't just a power grab. It was a masterclass in theatrical intimidation. He swaggered into meetings, barked orders with a flair that made generals and politicians alike wonder if they'd accidentally signed up for a one-man performance art show, and coerced enough people to pretend they weren't terrified, which is basically classic Napoleon. Mix confidence with intimidation and call it leadership. Some contemporaries were skeptical, of course. This Corsican thinks he can rule France, they muttered. But skepticism was a temporary inconvenience for Napoleon, like a pop-up ad nobody reads. He quickly dismantled the old political structures, replacing them with something that was technically a republic, but really just a stage for his ambitions. Because subtlety is overrated when you're destined to make history. Behind the scenes, he was meticulous, calculating, and low-key petty, keeping track of everyone's loyalty like a player in a high-stakes strategy game, and anyone who slipped up got a front-row ticket to the wrath of Napoleon, which could be dramatic, public, or both. The coup cemented his reputation as the guy who could seize opportunity like a hawk spotting a particularly tasty snack, and once he was officially in charge, he didn't waste time making sure the French public knew who was boss. Statues, proclamations, and yes, letters dripping with self-importance all did the heavy lifting. Of course, there were skeptics who whispered about the risk of one man holding so much power, but honestly, Napoleon thrived on proving skeptics wrong. It was basically his cardio. By the end of this political reshuffle, the Directory was effectively a historical footnote, and Napoleon had installed himself as first consul, the de facto ruler of France, with all the pomp, arrogance, and subtle self-worship one could desire. And honestly, watching him maneuver through this mess is wild, because he made it look effortless, like casually scoring the winning point in a game nobody else knew they were playing. The man had turned chaos into a personal runway, and the rest of France was basically watching him strut while trying not to trip over the political debris he left behind. Skill issue? Maybe, if you were anyone else. For Napoleon, it was just another Tuesday. Napoleon's coronation as emperor in 1804 was peak, look at me, I'm history's main character energy. The kind of unapologetic power move that felt less like tradition and more like a very public flex. The ceremony unfolded inside Notre Dame Cathedral, already soaked in centuries of drama, yet Napoleon still managed to outdo the building itself by making the moment scream, "Yes, I outrank literally everyone here, including the Pope," which he confirmed by lifting the crown and placing it on his own head, because following protocol was clearly optional when you believed destiny had RSVP'd personally. Crowds watched with awe, confusion, and a faint sense of existential whiplash, because this wasn't merely a coronation. It was a statement delivered in gold thread and deliberate silence. His robes shimmered with excess. The jewels reflected candlelight like they were trying to blind descent into submission. And the entire aesthetic whispered that legitimacy could apparently be manufactured through spectacle if applied confidently enough. Yet beneath the visual overload sat something colder and far more intentional: messaging. Napoleon didn't just want the title of emperor, he wanted the public to internalize the idea that his authority was inevitable, calculated, and somehow pre-approved by history itself. Courtiers scrambled to keep pace with shifting etiquette, soldiers stared with a mix of pride and disbelief, and the public absorbed a display of confidence so intense it bordered on engineered awe. While the organ echoed overhead, Napoleon was already thinking several moves ahead, planning how to consolidate power, shape public opinion, and ensure France moved when he decided it should, all while projecting calm certainty rather than naked force. The Pope, likely expecting spiritual center stage, became a symbolic accessory, reduced to a presence that legitimized the moment without controlling it. A quiet reminder that even religious authority bent under enough confidence. Artists, composers, and writers were carefully folded into the moment, tasked with translating ambition into imagery and memory, because Napoleon understood that history wasn't just written later, it was staged in real time. His inner circle took careful notes, learning that authority wasn't only enforced through armies, but through timing, symbolism, and relentless self-belief. Foreign dignitaries left unsettled rather than impressed, sensing that diplomacy had just been replaced by performance sharpened into policy. Watching the coronation unfold, it became clear that Napoleon had turned self-crowning into a mission statement: ignore limits, compress tradition, and make ambition look ordained. From that day forward, leadership and spectacle merged into one identity, and Europe quietly recalculated, realizing the challenge ahead wasn't France alone, but a man who treated power as something to be worn, rehearsed, and expanded. Napoleon's wars were basically him proving that if you had ambition, charm, and a tolerance for chaos, you could turn half the continent into your personal chessboard, and he embraced that responsibility with alarming enthusiasm. From Spain to Italy, from the Alps to the Low Countries, his campaigns unfolded as a blend of brilliance, luck, and moments of near-deranged confidence, because strategy, in his world, always came wrapped in relentless marches and carefully timed speeches. His enemies consistently underestimated him, a habit that aged poorly because he possessed a rare ability to read people, terrain, and political mood all at once, like a mind constantly refreshing multiple maps in real time. Soldiers admired him not only for victories, but for visibility. He appeared at the front, shared their risks, and made leadership feel personal rather than distant. But admiration came at a cost. Napoleon demanded everything, pushed armies past comfort and sometimes past reason, and expected loyalty that bordered on devotion. When his plans worked, they worked spectacularly. Rapid movements, decisive blows, and psychological pressure that left opposing commanders scrambling to keep up. When they didn't, the cracks showed quickly. Supply lines snapped, food vanished, and soldiers began to feel the consequences of ambition outrunning preparation, especially when winter and distance stopped cooperating. Even then, Napoleon refused to slow his momentum, reshaping setbacks into narratives of resilience and inevitability, feeding a legend that grew faster than reality could always support. Coalition after coalition rose against him, each one determined to stop the advance, yet most found themselves reacting rather than controlling the pace, chasing a man who rarely stayed still long enough to be cornered. His mind never rested, constantly calculating battlefield angles, diplomatic pressure, public image, and future campaigns at the same time, because dominance, to him, was never just military, it was psychological. The darker side followed closely: civilian suffering, scorched towns, officers dismissed without mercy, all consequences of a system that rewarded speed and success above restraint. Napoleon thrived in this atmosphere, energized by movement, pressure, and the intoxicating sense of being feared and followed simultaneously. His campaigns blurred into something larger than war alone, becoming a display of momentum, control, and relentless will. By the time his attention drifted toward Russia, he was no longer simply winning battles. He was chasing scale itself, pushing farther, faster, and harder, convinced that motion alone could outrun consequence. The Russian campaign of 1812 was Napoleon at his absolute peak of overconfidence, hubris, and apparently zero common sense, because marching hundreds of thousands of men into the icy abyss of Russia seemed like a fantastic idea at the times. He invaded with what he thought was an unstoppable army, but logistics quickly became a nightmare. Supplies disappeared faster than followers in a cancelled TikTok trend. Horses starved and soldiers froze, muttering things that would make your ears bleed if repeated aloud. The Russians, in classic move, didn't bother fighting a full-on battle at first. Instead, they burned villages, crops, and basically everything useful to an invading army, turning the landscape into a winter-themed horror show. Napoleon, of course, kept pushing forward, confident that sheer willpower could overcome frostbite, hunger, and strategic scorches. His troops admired him for courage and resented him for stubbornness, and honestly, it was a lot like being on a roller coaster designed by someone who clearly didn't care if you screamed. By the time they reached Moscow, the city was mostly deserted and on fire, which is history's version of a surprise, bet you didn't plan for this prank. Napoleon settled in, expecting a quick surrender or some grand Russian capitulation. But no, winter arrived like an uninvited ex, merciless and relentless, and his army began to collapse under cold, starvation, and disease. He made the fateful decision to retreat, and that retreat became legendary in the bad decisions that destroyed careers category. Temperatures dropped, morale plummeted, and stragglers were left behind like discarded baggage. The Grande Armée, once tens of thousands strong, dwindled into a pitiful ghost of its former self. Napoleon still tried to inspire confidence, issuing orders with dramatic flair, but there's only so much you can do when frostbite is your co-commander, and logistics is a cruel joke. The campaign was a brutal reminder that hubris is history's favorite seasoning, and even the best planners can get utterly crushed when Mother Nature decides to troll. Survivors told stories of unimaginable suffering, crossing rivers frozen solid, only to lose men to the ice, trudging through snow so deep it swallowed equipment, and scavenging what little food remained, all while Napoleon reportedly maintained his signature intensity, which is both admirable and slightly horrifying. Russia had effectively taken one of history's greatest military minds and served him a hard lesson in humility, with zero sugarcoating. The disaster reshaped Europe's balance of power and left Napoleon scrambling to recover both politically and militarily, proving that even legends have weak spots, and sometimes those weak spots come with frostbite. In the end, the Russian campaign wasn't just a military blunder. It was a brutal, dramatic, and utterly humiliating spectacle of ambition meeting reality, and the echoes of that failure would haunt him for the rest of his reign. Exiled to Elba in 1814, Napoleon found himself on what was basically a scenic timeout island, which, if you asked him, was probably less retirement and more boring prison with better weather. The island was tiny, picturesque, and full of Mediterranean vibes. But Napoleon quickly discovered that drama doesn't take a vacation just because you do. He was allowed to keep a small court, some loyal soldiers, and of course, his signature flair for theatrics, which he used liberally: parades, inspections, and proclamations that made him look like a mini emperor in perpetual rehearsal for a return that everyone assumed would never happen. He spent his days reorganizing local governments, improving infrastructure, and generally meddling like a legendary micromanager, because apparently even exile couldn't stop him from being extra. The locals had mixed feelings. Some adored him for the improvements. Others were probably muttering under their breath about this tiny man with an oversized ego bossing everyone around. Again, skill issue for Elba. Despite the island's small size, Napoleon refused to let boredom win. He trained, wrote memoirs, and schemed with the subtlety of a caffeinated raccoon, always plotting his next big move. Intelligence networks in Europe kept an eye on him, wondering if he had gone soft, which was a cute assumption because Napoleon's idea of soft was probably just slightly less dramatic tyranny. Friends, former generals, and ex-supporters sent letters filled with encouragement or excuses to visit, so he could gauge loyalty and test who might jump on board if he decided to make a comeback, which, spoiler alert, he was already planning. Even the British, who supervised the exile, were nervous because history had taught them that when Napoleon had time, space, and a mildly bored ego, chaos usually followed. He also used the island to craft his narrative, presenting himself as the wronged genius, misunderstood by Europe, which is exactly the branding you'd expect from someone who thinks crowns are optional, but glory is mandatory. Days on Elba were spent meticulously calculating supply chains, practicing speeches, and generally reminding everyone, even himself, that he was still very much Napoleon, in case anyone doubted it. He wasn't content with simply waiting out history. He wanted to rewrite it, and if that meant staging dramatic escapes, diplomatic maneuvers, or the occasional parade to remind people he existed, well, history would just have to deal. Elba was intended as punishment, but Napoleon turned it into an opportunity, a laboratory for strategy, an ego incubator, and a rehearsal stage for his inevitable return. By the time word of European unrest reached him, he was ready, well-rested, and annoyingly confident, proving once again that exile was basically a speed bump for his ambitions, not a barrier. In hindsight, Europe should have just accepted that boredom is Napoleon's kryptonite, but instead, they unknowingly set the stage for one of history's most audacious comebacks. Napoleon's escape from Elba in 1815 was less a daring military maneuver and more a masterclass in how to be extra while literally everyone panics, because apparently leaving a tiny island was the perfect time for theatrics. He slipped past his guards, boarded a ship with a few hundred loyalists, and sailed to the French mainland, arriving to crowds that were equal parts thrilled, terrified, and confused, like waking up to find your high school drama teacher running for president. Louis XVI, who had been placed on the throne after Napoleon's exile, suddenly realized that putting the Corsican genius in a scenic timeout hadn't actually solved anything. In fact, it was basically giving a cat a laser pointer and hoping it won't break the furniture. Napoleon landed in Cannes and began marching north, and the French army, which had been lukewarm about the new king, suddenly remembered why they loved this guy. He was charismatic, decisive, and slightly terrifying, all in the same sentence. Crowds greeted him with cheers, banners, and probably some faint disbelief, because honestly, who just comes back from exile like it's casual Monday morning? Within weeks, he had reclaimed Paris without a single major battle. showcasing a level of audacity that could be classified as criminally confident, or just criminal, depending on who's counting. Governments across Europe collectively groaned, realizing that the man they thought was on a permanent timeout had returned, fully energized, fully dramatic, and fully unwilling to play by anyone else's rules. Napoleon reinstated his previous ministers, reorganized the army, and gave speeches with that signature flair, reminding everyone that this wasn't some minor comeback. This was a headline, front page, I'm back, deal with it, moment. Some people admired him for sheer nerve, others hated him for obvious reasons, and historians would later argue about strategy, but no one could deny the sheer theatrical genius of the return. Europe tried to organize coalitions quickly, but Napoleon had momentum, morale, and the undeniable advantage of being both a legend and a terrifying presence. Basically, the ultimate combo. He had turned exile into a marketing campaign, plotting his own brand comeback while simultaneously destabilizing monarchies with his mere presence. It was audacious, reckless, and genius all at once, and it only reinforced the idea that Napoleon didn't just play the game of power, he rewrote the rules while making it look effortless. By the time he formally reclaimed the title of emperor, France was both exasperated and exhilarated, like a society-wide adrenaline rush with dramatic musical backing that only he could provide. And honestly, Europe had no idea what hit them. The man was back, energized, and ready to remind everyone why underestimating him was always a bad idea. The 100 Days had officially begun, and Napoleon was in full-on, let's make history tremble mode. Waterloo, 1815, was the ultimate cosmic clapback, the battlefield where Napoleon's ego met reality in a very dramatic, bloody handshake, and spoiler, reality won. He marched into Belgium with all the confidence of a guy who thought history owed him a favor, only to encounter Wellington and Blücher, who, unlike Napoleon, actually seemed to understand timing, terrain, and the value of not overextending your army. Napoleon had made mistakes before, sure, but this one was legendary. Overconfident attacks, miscommunications among his generals, and the stubborn refusal to adjust once things started going sideways. A classic I know better move that the universe apparently loves to punish. The battle started with bravado, with French artillery pounding relentlessly and troops charging like caffeinated maniacs, but the coalition forces held firm, leveraging defensive positions and the muddy, rain-soaked terrain that turned Napoleon's precision into chaos. By midday, he realized that even genius sometimes has limits, and the afternoon only confirmed it. Mismanaged reinforcements, exhausted soldiers, and cavalry that either arrived late or got lost in the mud turned his dream of another glorious victory into a logistical nightmare. Napoleon personally tried to rally troops, flitting from one hotspot to another, giving orders that, in theory, were brilliant, but in practice suffered from the very human flaw of too many moving pieces, too little time. Meanwhile, Wellington sipped metaphorical tea and watched like a chess master, exploiting Napoleon's aggression and turning his confidence into a liability. By the evening, the French lines were crumbling, morale was shattered, and Napoleon's iconic aura couldn't save what had already been lost. His army was broken, and the dream of reclaiming Europe dissolved into puddles of mud, blood, and bitter defeat. Retreat was inevitable, humiliation unavoidable, and for the first time in a long while, Napoleon faced the full weight of consequences he had expertly avoided for years. The man who had danced across Europe with victories and dramatic maneuvers now had to reckon with a battle that would echo in history as the place where hubris finally got its checkmate. Soldiers muttered curses, historians later debated blame, and Napoleon himself probably had a dramatic inner monologue about how the universe had been unnecessarily rude. Waterloo wasn't just a loss. It was a theatrical, brutal, and unavoidable lesson in mortality, leadership, and the limits of confidence. Europe collectively exhaled, realizing that the unstoppable force of history had met a wall, and the Corsican storm that had terrified and awed the continent was finally grounded, though the legend, of course, would never fade. Napoleon's aura survived the defeat, even as his empire crumbled, and the man who had once controlled Europe found himself facing the bitter aftertaste of ambition unchecked. After Waterloo, Napoleon was shipped off to St. Helena, which was basically history's ultimate permanent timeout island, remote, windswept, and intentionally annoying enough to keep him humble, or at least attempt it. The island had cliffs, jagged rocks, and enough wind to make every day feel like a mild existential crisis, which, knowing Napoleon, he probably found refreshing in a dramatic, tortured hero kind of way. He was stripped of real power, allowed only a small entourage of loyalists, and forced to live under constant British supervision, which is peak humiliation for a man who had once crowned himself emperor. He spent his days dictating memoirs, revisiting past campaigns, and obsessively analyzing battles, which is both productive and slightly sad, like a retired athlete constantly replaying games they already lost. Napoleon also had time to brood, complain about the food, and throw minor tantrums over the island's lack of sophistication, reminding everyone that exile didn't curb his ego so much as it gave it a scenic backdrop. Visitors, when allowed, were greeted with an intensity that could simultaneously charm, intimidate, and exhaust anyone within a 50-foot radius. He became hyper-focused on cementing his legacy, dictating narratives that portrayed him as the brilliant, wronged genius of Europe, while conveniently downplaying mistakes, because if anyone was going to control the story, it was Napoleon, even 6,000 miles from power. His health began declining, partly from stress, partly from the harsh climate, and partly from what historians politely call excessive worry and control issues, but he remained engaged, stubbornly correcting aides, debating strategy, and giving long monologues on how Europe had misunderstood him. The island became both prison and studio, a stage for endless performance where Napoleon remained the central figure, refusing to fade quietly. Even as his body weakened, his mind remained sharp, reliving campaigns, victories, and failures with obsessive clarity, creating detailed sketches and notes for posterity, or perhaps just to irritate anyone who disagreed with him. In the end, St. Helena was less about punishment and more about the ironic reality that a man who once dominated Europe could now be reduced to a tiny island, arguing with the wind and recording memoirs for a future that would inevitably mythologize him. The exile was permanent, inescapable, and subtly humiliating, yet Napoleon's presence still commanded attention, proving that power and personality can persist even in isolation. While the world moved on, he had already secured the one thing he truly desired: immortality in the story of history, even if it came with sea breezes, monotony, and the occasional dramatic sigh. Napoleon's legacy after St. Helena became a cocktail of legend, meme-level drama, and cautionary tales that historians, novelists, and over-enthusiastic YouTubers have been binging on ever since. His name was everywhere: textbooks, paintings, statues, and awkwardly dramatic quotes that sounded better in French and worse in translation, proving that ego really does travel well. People argued endlessly about whether he was a military genius, a tyrant, or just a man who really liked his own reflection. And honestly, he probably would have enjoyed the debate. Anything to keep attention on him. His victories were studied, his defeats dissected, and his flair for the dramatic became part of the cultural DNA of Europe, because nothing says influencer like rewriting history while you're still alive, and even more so when you're dead. Napoleon became a symbol of ambition unchained, the ultimate case study in how charisma, strategy, and sheer audacity can make you unstoppable, terrifying, and occasionally laughable all at once. His image evolved into almost mythical proportions. Tiny man, massive impact, endless quotes about leadership and destiny that people conveniently ignored when convenient. Biographers and storytellers leaned into the chaos he created, the audacity he displayed, and the sheer unpredictability of a man who went from a rocky island in the Mediterranean to controlling Europe, and then being reduced to windy exile, because humans love a dramatic arc with plenty of humiliation and redemption vibes. His life was used as a blueprint, a warning, and a meme before memes existed, proving that some personalities are just too big for their own timeline. Meanwhile, everyday people debated endlessly whether his brilliance justified the bloodshed or whether he was just history's favorite chaos agent. Probably a bit of both. Napoleon inspired armies, terrified monarchs, and annoyed generations of historians, which is peak performance if your metric is influence on literally everything for centuries. His story also highlighted the hazards of ambition, the fragility of power, and the comedic tragedy of overconfidence, while simultaneously giving future generations endless material for dramatic reenactments, films, and sarcastic takes like this one. By the time his story fully sank into historical consciousness, Napoleon had become larger than life, flawed, brilliant, excessive, and unforgettable, the kind of figure who makes people gasp, roll their eyes, and take notes all at once. Europe had survived him, societies had rebuilt, but his legend remained, echoing in military academies, literature, and casual conversations about how one small guy somehow almost broke the continent. In the end, Napoleon was not just a man of history, he was history itself in motion, chaotic, ambitious, theatrical, and undeniably human, a reminder that sometimes life's greatest spectacles come from people who refuse to stay small, literally or figuratively. And so, for better or worse, the Corsican storm lives on, immortalized, dissected, and endlessly debated because some personalities are just too messy and too brilliant to ever fade quietly. Isabella of France entered the story like someone who had absolutely not signed up for the group project she was assigned, and yet here she was anyway, married off to Edward of England while still basically a teenager, because medieval diplomacy loved efficiency more than feelings. The marriage had looked great on parchment, all neat alliances and mutual threats handled, but in reality it felt awkward from the first bow. Edward was already emotionally married to his favorites, and Isabella quickly realized she had joined a household where she ranked somewhere below political pets and emotional distractions. Court life hummed with rituals and expectations, and she learned fast that queens were supposed to smile, produce heirs, and stay conveniently quiet. Chemistry was not on the syllabus. Edward treated her with a distant politeness that felt rehearsed, like he was ticking a box labeled wife, while his real attention wandered elsewhere. Isabella noticed everything, because young queens had little else to do besides observe and remember. She watched how Edward lit up around certain companions, how his generosity flowed freely toward them, and how her own presence barely stirred the air. England itself felt cold, damp, and suspicious, and the court reflected that mood perfectly. People whispered behind tapestries and measured every gesture as if affection were a dangerous resource that needed rationing. Isabella tried, at first, to play her role properly. She learned English customs, adapted her manners, and offered loyalty even when it was not warmly returned. But the imbalance was obvious. Edward's emotional neglect was not dramatic, just persistent, which somehow made it worse. It was the kind of quiet disappointment that settled in and refused to leave. The court noticed the mismatch too, though everyone pretended not to, because acknowledging royal discomfort was considered rude and politically inconvenient. Isabella was young, sharp, and not stupid, and she began to understand that love in royal marriages was optional, sometimes even discouraged. What mattered was usefulness, obedience, and timing. Still, she felt the sting of being sidelined, especially when her position should have guaranteed attention. Nights passed in formality, days passed in ceremony, and her role felt strangely hollow. She had power in theory, jewels in abundance, and titles that echoed impressively, but very little warmth. The marriage functioned, technically, which was enough for most observers. Yet beneath the surface, the absence of affection quietly shaped her outlook. This was not the dramatic heartbreak of songs and poems, but a slow realization that loyalty might never be reciprocated. Isabella did not yet plan rebellion or romance. She simply stored the knowledge away. The seeds of future decisions were planted not by passion, but by neglect, which history often underestimated until it was far too late. That early silence taught her more about power than affection ever could, because when someone ignored you completely, they underestimated you, and underestimation was the one mistake courts repeated with impressive consistency, especially with young queens who listened carefully and waited patiently for openings. Isabella grew up quickly, not because she wanted to, but because medieval courts had no patience for emotional development arcs, and England especially expected instant maturity from anyone wearing a crown. The girl, who had arrived uncertain and observant, slowly sharpened into someone more alert, less hopeful, and significantly harder to impress. Edward did not suddenly change, which was kind of the point. His attention remained selectively focused, his priorities consistently elsewhere, and Isabella's tolerance thinned with each public slight that everyone pretended was nothing. She learned that patience was praised in queens, but only when it benefited men, and that silence was admired until it became inconvenient. Over time, she stopped mistaking neglect for accident. It was deliberate, habitual, and very much part of the system. Isabella adjusted accordingly. She learned when to speak and when to disappear into the background, which ironically made people forget she was paying attention. Court politics moved like a slow, petty chess game, and she memorized patterns instead of reacting emotionally. Her role as mother gave her visibility, but not influence, and even that visibility came with rules written by others. Edward's affection remained unreliable, appearing in formal bursts and vanishing just as fast, like a seasonal courtesy rather than a constant bond. Isabella noticed how alliances formed through favoritism, how resentment brewed quietly among nobles, and how dissatisfaction spread in whispers that never quite reached the throne. England itself felt unstable, and the king's judgment was increasingly questioned, though rarely to his face. Isabella watched as frustration pooled beneath politeness, and she began to understand that personal disappointment and political weakness often overlapped. The court's mood shifted from tolerating Edward's behavior to quietly resenting it, and Isabella, still officially powerless, found herself emotionally aligned with that growing discontent. She had been trained to endure, but endurance without purpose grew exhausting. Her patience did not vanish overnight, it eroded. She still played the queen, hosted ceremonies, smiled at the right moments, and upheld appearances with professional consistency. But internally, her expectations changed. She stopped hoping for affection and started evaluating outcomes. Love, she realized, was not essential to survival, but leverage was. The transformation was subtle enough that few noticed, which worked in her favor. Isabella's composure became sharper, her silence more intentional. She observed how loyalty was rewarded inconsistently and how mistakes were forgiven selectively. Edward's inability to read the emotional temperature around him became obvious, and Isabella noted it with growing clarity. She was no longer simply enduring her marriage, she was outgrowing it. The disappointment that once felt personal now seemed structural, baked into a monarchy that confused indulgence with strength. By the time Isabella reached full adulthood, she had learned that waiting did not mean surrendering. It meant watching, counting, and remembering every slight, every misstep, every opportunity ignored. Her patience did not disappear. It evolved into something colder, more strategic, and far less forgiving, which would eventually matter far more than youthful devotion ever could. Edward's habit of surrounding himself with favorites did not remain a private irritation for long, because courts were allergic to imbalance and absolutely loved gossip, especially when favoritism came with rewards, titles, and access that bypassed traditional hierarchies. Isabella watched as certain men gained influence at an alarming speed, their proximity to the king translating directly into power, while experienced nobles were politely sidelined. The vibes, as one might say, were deeply off. Edward seemed oblivious to the resentment building around him, or perhaps he simply did not care, which amounted to the same thing. His choices strained finances, offended aristocratic pride, and quietly destabilized loyalty, and Isabella stood nearby, publicly composed, privately unimpressed. She did not need to stoke anger. It generated itself naturally. Nobles compared notes, whispered frustrations, and began to see the queen less as a decorative accessory and more as a fellow sufferer in Edward's increasingly chaotic leadership style. Isabella's isolation eased slightly as shared irritation formed informal bonds. She still lacked formal authority, but her symbolic position mattered quietly, especially when paired with growing public dissatisfaction. Edward's favorites, meanwhile, enjoyed lavish gifts and unchecked influence, behaving with the confidence of people who assumed the spotlight would never move. This assumption proved historically unwise. Isabella noticed patterns repeating. The more Edward leaned into favoritism, the more legitimacy he bled. The kingdom did not implode instantly, but tension settled in like fog, thick and persistent. Isabella's role remained constrained, yet her awareness sharpened. She became fluent in reading political weather, sensing shifts before they became obvious. Her restraint was interpreted as weakness by some, which again worked in her favor. Underestimation remained her most reliable shield. Edward's governance increasingly reflected personal preference rather than measured judgment, and the consequences became harder to ignore. Financial strain, political embarrassment, and noble frustration piled up, while Edward seemed oddly surprised that actions had repercussions. Isabella did not lecture him. Queens rarely could. Instead, she absorbed information, quietly aligned herself with discontented voices, and maintained plausible deniability at all times. She learned that influence did not always require command, only timing and trust. The court's perception of her shifted slowly from neglected wife to quiet constant, someone who endured without complaint while others overreached. That contrast mattered. Edward's favorites grew louder, more visible, and increasingly resented, while Isabella remained steady, observant, and strategically absent from open conflict. The imbalance widened, and with it, the sense that the king's household no longer functioned as a unified center of power. Isabella saw clearly what Edward could not. Authority eroded not through dramatic rebellion, but through repeated, careless choices that alienated everyone except a chosen few. The kingdom noticed. History took notes. Isabella remembered everything, because when chaos announces itself loudly, the quiet people usually end up deciding what happens next. Resentment did not turn Isabella loud or reckless. It turned her precise, which was far more dangerous and far less theatrical than anyone expected. She understood by now that direct confrontation was for people with armies or unquestioned authority, and she had neither, at least not on paper. What she had instead was patience refined into discipline and an emotional distance that allowed her to think clearly while others fumed. Edward's missteps continued, and with each one, Isabella's private assessments grew sharper. She no longer framed her experience as personal misfortune. She categorized it as political reality. The shift mattered. She watched how Edward's authority weakened not because of enemies abroad, but because of erosion within his own circle. Loyalty frayed, trust evaporated. Isabella remained publicly supportive because irony loved a good disguise. Her quiet presence became oddly reassuring to those unsettled by Edward's volatility. She listened more than she spoke, which encouraged others to speak freely around her. People often mistook silence for ignorance, and Isabella let them. She understood that resentment, when managed properly, could be educational. The court's atmosphere thickened with unease, and Isabella's internal map of alliances became increasingly detailed. She noticed which nobles grew bolder in their criticism, which remained cautiously neutral, and which doubled down on loyalty to Edward's favorites despite the shifting winds. Every reaction told her something. She also learned when absence spoke louder than protest. Isabella withdrew strategically at moments when her presence would have lent legitimacy to decisions she did not support. These absences were noted, though rarely acknowledged aloud. Edward, predictably, failed to read them correctly. He mistook her restraint for resignation, which allowed her more room to maneuver later. Her resentment became a tool rather than a wound. She understood that power did not announce itself. It accumulated quietly. Isabella cultivated an image of reliability, someone consistent in a court full of unpredictable behavior. This consistency attracted trust, especially among those tired of spectacle. She did not plot openly, because open plotting attracted swift consequences. Instead, she allowed dissatisfaction to circulate naturally, like air in a closed room, slowly but inevitably affecting everyone. Her emotional detachment from Edward freed her from illusions, which ironically made her more effective as a queen than affection ever had. She still fulfilled her ceremonial duties, still played the expected roles, but her internal loyalty had shifted from person to principle, or perhaps to outcome. Isabella's education in power had not come from tutors or manuals. It came from neglect, observation, and the steady realization that endurance alone changed nothing. What mattered was direction. By the time resentment hardened into resolve, Isabella was no longer reacting to Edward's failures. She was anticipating consequences, preparing herself for moments when action would be unavoidable. Her calm masked intention, and her intention grew stronger with every misjudgment Edward made. The court remained unaware of how thoroughly she had outgrown her role as passive queen, because transformation rarely announced itself with ceremony. It arrived quietly, patiently, and very much on schedule. Roger Mortimer entered Isabella's orbit without fanfare, which already set him apart in a court addicted to grand entrances and exaggerated loyalties. He was competent in a way that felt almost suspicious, the kind of man who understood logistics, alliances, and timing, and did not confuse noise with effectiveness. Isabella noticed him not because of romance at first, but because he made sense, which was rare and therefore compelling. Mortimer had his own grievances with Edward's governance, and unlike others, he articulated them with clarity rather than tantrums. Their interactions were initially practical, shaped by shared frustration and mutual intelligence, not dramatic longing. Isabella appreciated that he spoke to her as if she were capable of thought, which felt revolutionary in a setting where queens were often treated as decorative punctuation. Conversations stretched longer than expected. Ideas aligned too easily. Trust formed quietly without declarations. The connection grew in the negative space left by Edward's absence, filling gaps that had long been ignored. Isabella did not rush into affection. She evaluated risk first. Mortimer, for his part, understood discretion, which made him safer than most. Their bond developed through strategy before sentiment, and that order mattered. It grounded their relationship in shared purpose rather than escapism. As their alignment deepened, the political implications became impossible to ignore. This was no secret courtly flirtation destined for poetry. It was the convergence of ambition, resentment, and opportunity. Isabella recognized that Mortimer offered something Edward never had: partnership. He listened, adjusted, responded. That alone altered her perception of what power could feel like. The forbidden aspect of their growing closeness added tension, but it was not the main attraction. The real draw was effectiveness. Together, they saw clearly how fragile Edward's position had become, how much dissatisfaction simmered beneath forced loyalty. Isabella's role shifted subtly from observer to participant. Mortimer did not dominate her decisions. He amplified them. Their collaboration sharpened her resolve and clarified her options. The court, predictably, underestimated the significance of their alignment. People saw scandal where strategy lived, because scandal was easier to process. Isabella allowed that misinterpretation to stand. It distracted from the real threat, which was coordination. She understood that love, when paired with purpose, became something more disruptive than rebellion. Mortimer's presence did not make her reckless, it made her precise. Plans began to feel less hypothetical, more inevitable. Edward remained distracted, indulgent, and oblivious, mistaking stability for control. Isabella and Mortimer did not announce their intentions. They waited, refined, and prepared, aware that timing would determine everything. What began as mutual understanding evolved into a partnership that blended emotion with calculation, which history would later simplify into scandal because nuance rarely survived retelling. Yet at its core, their bond was not born of impulse. It emerged from shared clarity in a kingdom increasingly governed by denial. Isabella did not fall blindly. She stepped deliberately into a connection that promised both affection and leverage, and for the first time, those two things aligned. Love, once acknowledged, did not soften Isabella's judgment. It sharpened it, which felt almost unfair to everyone else involved. Whispers began circulating, because whispers always did, and the court proved once again that it could detect scandal faster than structural collapse. Isabella understood the risk, but she also understood momentum. The relationship with Mortimer moved from shared awareness into coordinated intention, and intention had weight. Plans were not sketched dramatically over candlelight. They evolved through careful conversations, tested assumptions, and an almost boring level of preparation. That boredom was the point. Isabella had learned that chaos thrived on impulse, and she had no interest in repeating Edward's mistakes. Rumors of her dissatisfaction grew louder, but Edward dismissed them because he had long mistaken her restraint for harmlessness. The whispers turned into expectations into quiet alignment among nobles who sensed the wind changing direction. Isabella became a focal point without announcing herself as one. She did not call for rebellion. She made herself available to those already considering it. Mortimer's role expanded naturally, acting as bridge, organizer, and proof that opposition could be competent rather than theatrical. Their partnership functioned like a pressure valve for collective frustration. Love, in this context, became political not because it was forbidden, but because it connected grievances into structure. Isabella maintained plausible decorum publicly, which confused observers and delayed reaction. Edward remained distracted, indulgent, and oddly trusting, continuing to prioritize personal comfort over strategic awareness. His blindness was not dramatic, it was habitual. Isabella's movements became more deliberate. She traveled when necessary, spoke selectively, and allowed discontent to crystallize around shared objectives rather than emotional outrage. The idea was not revenge, though resentment existed. It was resolution. The kingdom did not need a tantrum. It needed intervention. Isabella's internal calculus balanced risk against inevitability, and she judged the latter greater. The whispers reached a point where silence became suspicious, yet Edward still failed to respond meaningfully. His authority thinned, stretched too far by neglect and favoritism until it barely held shape. Isabella and Mortimer waited for the moment when resistance would feel less like treason and more like correction. That moment arrived not with drama, but with exhaustion. Nobles were tired. The public was uneasy. Loyalty had become performative. Isabella recognized the opening because she had lived inside its build-up. Love had not distracted her from responsibility. It had clarified it. Together, they shifted from preparation to execution, not abruptly, but decisively. The court sensed something was happening, though few understood what or how far it would go. Edward, tragically consistent, noticed too late. By then, the whispers had aligned, the plans had matured, and the queen he had underestimated had already stepped beyond the role he believed contained her. The story moved forward without asking permission, because history rarely did. Revenge, when it arrived, was quieter than most imagined, and far more elegant than Edward could have anticipated. Isabella did not storm into confrontation. She orchestrated a sequence of moves that looked almost accidental, like fate had finally decided to intervene while everyone else remained distracted. Mortimer acted as both partner and amplifier, his competence ensuring that their coordinated plans were executed with precision. Edward's habitual neglect and overconfidence worked against him at every step. Nobles, who had long simmered in frustration, found their hesitations replaced by clarity once Isabella's intentions became visible, though still cloaked in the veneer of legitimacy. The queen, who had once been sidelined, now became the axis around which opposition turned, not through chaos, but through controlled, purposeful action. Letters, alliances, and subtle threats moved faster than Edward's awareness could track, and his favorites, once symbols of his power, became liabilities. Isabella understood the psychology of underestimation. She had been underestimated for years, first as a young, awkward bride, then as a neglected queen, and finally as a silent observer. Each instance had taught her that quiet endurance was more effective than loud protest. Edward's authority crumbled gradually, a victim of negligence as much as rebellion, and by the time he recognized the depth of his vulnerability, the pattern had already solidified. Mortimer's presence made the transition smoother because he brought decisiveness where Edward had left uncertainty, confidence where Edward had left indulgence, and structure where Edward had left whim. Isabella's love for Mortimer did not obscure her strategic vision. If anything, it refined it. Their combined influence reshaped loyalties, not through coercion, but through alignment of shared interests. Nobles quickly discerned that siding with Isabella was safer than continuing to gamble on Edward's unpredictable temperament. The process, though methodical, carried dramatic irony that would not escape chroniclers. Edward, who had ignored warnings, misread intentions, and dismissed quiet power, faced the consequences not with insight, but with belated panic. Isabella, poised and deliberate, leveraged every underestimation, every mistake, every lapse in judgment, turning them into opportunity. By the time direct confrontation seemed inevitable, Edward's support network had already eroded beyond repair. What looked like sudden rebellion to outsiders was actually the culmination of years of careful observation, restrained action, and quietly nurtured alliances. Isabella's restraint had been deliberate. Her patience was strategic. Her affection for Mortimer made her resolve personal but never reckless. In the end, victory was not a spectacle of brute force or emotion-driven chaos. It was a demonstration that quiet intelligence, combined with timely action and a partner capable of execution, could override even a king's long-standing negligence. History framed it as scandal, but beneath the sensational accounts, it was an elegant exercise in timing, psychology, and controlled power. The kingdom shifted, loyalties realigned, and Edward's mismanagement became the textbook example of underestimated vulnerability. Isabella, once sidelined, emerged not only loved but influential, having turned personal dissatisfaction into political inevitability. The aftermath of Isabella's calculated defiance was messy, colorful, and absolutely irresistible to chroniclers who loved to frame her as a scandalous queen when in reality she had simply outmaneuvered a distracted king. Edward was deposed from the vantage point of influence he had long taken for granted, his favorites scattered, his decisions questioned, and his authority rendered almost theatrical in its impotence. Isabella, on the other hand, consolidated her position with an ease that suggested she had been born for this role rather than thrust into it. Mortimer remained a central figure, both as ally and as the practical executor of plans, their partnership now unmistakable, though still officially unspoken. The court, predictably, oscillated between awe, fear, and gossipy fascination, because no one likes seeing a queen succeed so efficiently. It challenges the comforting narrative that men always control the plot. Isabella's triumph was quieter than a battlefield victory, but far more effective, because it reshaped England's power structures without the usual theatrics of war. Nobles who had doubted her insight now acknowledged her influence, albeit in whispers and cautious bowing, and the public narrative spun around her morality and charm rather than her cunning, because scandal sells better than competence. Her relationship with Mortimer became a mix of political necessity and genuine affection, a rare alignment that gave them both leverage and satisfaction. Edward, displaced and disgraced, remained a figure of private resentment and public sympathy, though his failures had been as much his own doing as any external force could dictate. Isabella, meanwhile, moved forward with the quiet confidence of someone who understood that love, patience, observation, and strategy combined could alter the trajectory of kingdoms. Her story, often simplified into morality tales about forbidden love or scandalous ambition, was in truth a study of calculated endurance and smart alignment with opportunity. She had turned neglect into awareness, observation into action, and personal desire into structured, effective change. Mortimer's loyalty and competence amplified what Isabella had always possessed in quiet abundance, an understanding of how human nature, politics, and timing intersect. In the end, history recorded her as a queen who defied convention, manipulated circumstances, and pursued personal affection alongside political leverage. But the deeper truth was subtler and perhaps more impressive. She had survived, thrived, and rewritten expectations without ever losing composure. England shifted around her, not because she had shouted or wielded brute force, but because she had recognized patterns, anticipated moves, and acted with precision, patience, and just enough audacity to tip the scales. Lovers, conspirators, and monarchs alike left their marks, but Isabella's legacy remained singular, a queen who transformed limitation into strategy, marginalization into power, and a private bond into a catalyst for historical change, proving that sometimes the quietest moves leave the loudest echoes. Her story concluded with irony, affection, and a clear demonstration that underestimated women rarely forget and even more rarely fail. King John of England, famously cranky and perpetually in a bad mood, ruled like someone scrolling through a feed that was 90% bad news and 10% taxes owed. He had this uncanny ability to make everyone around him simultaneously terrified and exasperated, which, for a medieval monarch, was basically a superpower. His reign, starting in 1199, was peppered with bouts of impulsive decisions that made even his closest advisors clutch their chains in despair. One week, he'd grant lands or titles generously, probably just to look benevolent in a chronicler's notebook, and the next, he'd demand double taxes from barons whose lands had just been burned by some unfortunate skirmish, because obviously fire damage didn't count as a financial hardship. The man had a talent for turning minor disputes into full-blown vendettas, like a reality TV star escalating a petty Twitter feud into international drama. Rumor had it that his temper wasn't just legendary, it was strategically applied to keep people guessing whether dinner would be a feast or an execution. The barons, those sharp, scheming landowners who usually spent their time plotting each other's downfall, had never encountered someone who could be both cunning and catastrophically careless at the same time. Every failed campaign in France, every broken alliance, every extortionate tax raised in the dead of winter piled onto a mountain of resentment that John didn't see, or didn't care to see, because he had bigger concerns, like whether his wine was chilled correctly, or if the messenger dared look at him the wrong way. Even the Pope got involved at one point, which is the medieval equivalent of HR being called in to deal with an impossible boss who insists their coffee table is holy ground. Historians have long debated whether John's mismanagement was sheer incompetence, a cunning test of loyalty, or some mix of both. Looking at the Baron's eventual reaction, the answer is probably a chaotic blend of "oh no" and "this is absurd." While Europe churned with the usual wars and diplomacy, England under John became a pressure cooker of tax complaints, legal disputes, and endless whisper networks among the nobility. Every village had someone muttering, "Here comes the king again," as if he were a storm that no one could predict. It wasn't just about money or land. It was about dignity, control, and the audacity of a king who somehow thought he could rewrite rules whenever it suited him. By the time the barons started murmuring about "maybe we don't have to take this," John had already done a dozen things that made that statement not just reasonable, but inevitable. The stage was perfectly set for rebellion, and the irony was delicious. The king, who demanded loyalty at every turn, was the one teaching everyone how to organize against him, all while grumbling that life was unfair. So, in essence, John's reign was like a long, awkward group chat where one person kept throwing tantrums and everyone else slowly plotted a mutiny, knowing full well that the drama would be worth retelling for centuries. The barons, after enduring years of King John's unpredictable rule, finally had their collective aha moment, realizing that they didn't actually have to nod politely every time he demanded more gold, land, or loyalty. It was a revelation that hit like a medieval TikTok trend. Suddenly, saying no wasn't treason, it was self-preservation. These guys, who were normally too busy squabbling over chicken rights and hunting privileges to coordinate anything, started exchanging letters, whispering in corridors, and generally conspiring like it was the hottest gossip of the year. Each baron had a mix of frustration, fear, and a tiny thrill at the thought of standing up to the king, which was basically the medieval version of sending a read receipt that said, "I see your tyrant energy, and I'm not impressed." The meetings were chaotic. Some barons showed up in full armor, just in case John decided to crash the party personally, while others brought accountants, because yes, some fights were won with ledgers before swords. The idea wasn't just rebellion for rebellion's sake. It was about protecting their estates, asserting influence, and quietly enjoying the fact that the king, who had spent so long pretending he was untouchable, was suddenly very touchable in political terms. They began to draft petitions, laying out their grievances in that elegant, flowery script that made complaints sound almost polite, but definitely threatening. Every clause subtly shouted, "Do not mess with us, John," in a way that only a baron with decades of hereditary power could pull off. Some of them probably muttered under their breath about how John's previous kingly predecessors might have done the same thing, but, shocker, with slightly less dramatic flair. Rumors swirled of secret alliances forming, and spies, yes, actual medieval spies, ran from castle to castle, ensuring that no one was secretly loyal to the king in the way that mattered. The barons also learned the power of optics. If you look unified and serious, even a king who controls an army might hesitate before turning his rage on you. John, meanwhile, was busy sending contradictory orders and double-crossing himself without realizing it, because multitasking anger and governance was apparently beyond him. By the time the barons had fully convened, the momentum was irresistible. They weren't just defending land, they were defending the idea that maybe, just maybe, a king should follow rules and not act like a cosmic troll. There was an odd sense of camaraderie, a mix of smugness and fear, as these lords realized they were wielding the kind of power John had underestimated, the power of collective, "Nah, we're good." And so, armed with swords, ledgers, and a newfound appreciation for civil disobedience, the barons inched toward the audacious notion that they could bend the king to their will without anyone needing a single catapult just yet. It was the first chapter of organized resistance, executed with awkward elegance, dramatic letters, and a lot of side-eyes at court events, which, in hindsight, made perfect sense for anyone who wanted history to notice. The Magna Carta, that little piece of parchment that would later get way more Instagram clout than John ever had, started life as a desperate attempt to calm down a very hangry group of barons. In 1215, after months of tense negotiations, frantic scribbling, and the kind of passive-aggressive diplomacy that would make modern office workers proud, the document was finalized at Runnymede. Essentially, it was a medieval terms and conditions that even John had to sign, though he probably grumbled through the entire process, muttering about how paper was so unfairly powerful. The clauses ranged from the surprisingly practical, like limits on taxation without baronial consent, to the absurdly specific, such as protecting widows from being forced into marriages they didn't want, which shows that even back then, someone somewhere was thinking, okay, this is getting ridiculous. The barons, waving their quills like wands, knew they were onto something. The document wasn't just a list of complaints, it was a manifesto that shouted, in polite but firm handwriting, "King, you are not above the rules, and yes, we will enforce this." John signed, or more accurately scrawled, with a face probably somewhere between indignation and fury, realizing that his reign had officially entered the era of passive rebellion wrapped in legal jargon. Everyone involved knew it was a gamble. Barons would hold the paper up like a shield, while John, who had already shown a talent for ignoring inconvenient truths, might treat it as a minor suggestion rather than binding law. And that's exactly what happened. The Magna Carta's fame, however, didn't just come from its immediate effect, though that was dramatic enough, but from its potential. It became a symbol of collective bargaining, of the idea that even kings had limits, and that noble networks could enforce them. Chroniclers gushed, and some probably exaggerated, about the solemnity of the ceremony, making it sound like a mix of royal coronation and a medieval group therapy session. Historians, in retrospect, noted that the document was both brilliant and fragile, like a sandcastle made of ink, destined to be torn apart and patched up repeatedly over the next century. Yet for the barons, it was victory. Not a total victory, because John's next moves proved that he was neither subtle nor particularly law-abiding, but enough to give them hope that rules could exist beyond royal whim. There was a strange thrill in holding a king accountable. The nobles compared notes in their castles, shared gossip about who looked smug, who looked terrified, and who was already plotting the next "oops, did I just ignore the Magna Carta?" moment. For anyone observing from the outside, it was baffling yet strangely satisfying. A bunch of powerful men and a grumpy king, all pretending that a piece of paper could really control the chaos of medieval England. And yet, for the first time, it kind of did. The document had entered history as a peace treaty, a threat, and a conversation starter for centuries to come, all wrapped into one awkwardly serious ceremony. Once the Magna Carta was signed, the lines between negotiation and outright low-key blackmail blurred faster than you could say medieval drama. The barons didn't exactly trust King John to honor the document, and honestly, who could blame them? He had the subtlety of a bull in a chandelier store, and every clause of the charter became a potential bargaining chip, a tiny landmine, or a threat, depending on how you waved it around. Meetings turned into tense staring contests, where every word was weighed, analyzed, and sometimes deliberately misinterpreted, just to see who would flinch first. Letters were exchanged with the kind of formal politeness that, in context, screamed "comply or else," and the king, predictably, had a meltdown over each one. The barons, some in full armor, and others clutching legal documents like medieval smartphones, treated the process as a combination of chess, poker, and a reality TV show called Keeping Up with John's Tantrums. It was negotiation in the way that made you suspect someone had invented passive aggression specifically for medieval aristocrats. John tried, as always, to assert dominance, issuing contradictory orders and threatening excommunication-level punishments. But the barons had already realized that threatening him with collective action, armed rebellion, public shaming in front of other nobles, and careful legal interpretation was surprisingly effective. In fact, some historians joke that this period could have been subtitled "How to Politely Terrorize Your King Without Losing Your Castle." Spies and messengers crisscrossed the countryside to ensure everyone knew exactly who was backing whom, because coordination was key when your life, your estates, and your pride were all on the line. The king tried small maneuvers to break their unity, offering bribes, titles, and promises of mercy. But the barons were having none of it. They had seen too many empty words to fall for another sugar-coated disaster. At one point, John even tried to summon the Pope to nullify the Magna Carta, which was like asking HR to fire the office bully. You know, theoretically possible, but messy and dramatic. The barons, sensing both the absurdity and the opportunity, doubled down on their demands, subtly reminding the king that a united aristocracy had armies, resources, and zero patience for tantrums. The whole process became almost performative, with each side testing the other, bluffing, threatening, and occasionally laughing at the sheer ridiculousness of a king being held hostage by a piece of paper and a collective glare. And yet, underneath all the sarcasm, medieval humor, and drama, the stakes were terrifyingly real. Defiance could lead to war, confiscation, or worse, while compliance could cost prestige and leverage. So, the dance continued, an awkward, tense, and sometimes hilarious tango of diplomacy and intimidation, where the line between negotiation and low-key blackmail was not just thin, it was practically invisible. By the end, everyone involved knew they had changed the game, even if only temporarily, and that history would watch their audacity with a mix of awe and snarky commentary. By the time open rebellion actually kicked off, England looked like a giant medieval group chat gone horribly wrong. with castles as emojis and armies as aggressive notifications. The barons, now fully committed, moved with a combination of strategy, luck, and sheer stubbornness that made the chaos feel almost cinematic. Arrows flew, banners waved, and horses clattered across the countryside as both sides tried to assert dominance, though strategy often took a back seat to who could yell the loudest or make the most dramatic entrance. Some barons seemed to think that wearing extra armor made them invincible, while others relied on clever alliances and secret agreements that, honestly, were like plotting a surprise birthday party, but with lethal consequences. John, predictably, was simultaneously furious and confused, flitting from castle to castle, issuing decrees that were often contradictory, like demanding loyalty from one group while threatening them with siege the next day. Supply lines, communication, and morale became the real battlegrounds. Barons had to feed their men, keep them paid, and ensure that no one switched sides mid-fight, all while navigating the unpredictable moods of their allies. Negotiations continued alongside fighting, with letters arriving in the middle of sieges, reminding everyone that yes, civil war was inconvenient, but deadlines and paperwork waited for no one. In some battles, small skirmishes escalated because someone misinterpreted a signal flag or just felt personally offended, turning what should have been minor raids into full-scale confrontations. Rumors and misinformation spread faster than actual armies could march, with tales of betrayals, massacres, and heroic stands becoming exaggerated in letters and chronicles, which only heightened the tension. Despite all the chaos, there was a strange rhythm to the rebellion: attacks, retreats, alliances forming and breaking, and repeated attempts to lure John into traps that never quite worked. It was organized chaos, a kind of tactical performance art where everyone wanted to prove they were cleverer than the king and their fellow nobles, and also that they could survive the absurdity of war. By the end of these intense campaigns, England had seen more banners than a tourist gift shop, and morale among both rebels and royalists had dipped and soared like a roller coaster designed by someone who clearly hated predictability. The barons, exhausted but emboldened, realized that their combined audacity could challenge the king in ways that no single lord could, and that chaos itself was a tool, confusing, draining, but effective. John's usual temper tantrums were amplified by the rebellion, creating a feedback loop of aggression, mistakes, and opportunistic barons. It was messy, theatrical, and somehow still surprisingly effective, setting the stage for temporary resolutions, betrayals, and those signature medieval "wait, what just happened?" moments. The rebellion, at its peak, was less about ideology and more about practical, brutal, sometimes absurd demonstrations of power, and the barons were living for it. King John, predictably, responded to the rebellion with what could only be described as full-on overkill, the medieval equivalent of an angry CEO burning the office to prove a point. He mobilized his forces with dramatic flair, galloping from one region to another like a man who just discovered caffeine and a grudge, issuing orders that were simultaneously threatening, confusing, and occasionally contradictory. Villages cowered, castles fortified themselves, and chroniclers noted with a mix of awe and exasperation that John's wrath was both terrifying and kind of over the top. Entire towns were punished for the perceived slights of single barons, taxes were hiked to record levels, and random confiscations of property left no one quite sure whether they were safe or secretly doomed. It wasn't just strategic, it was personal. John wanted to make a statement. Defiance would be met with relentless theatrical retribution, the kind of over-the-top response that even history would later describe with a hint of sarcasm. His knights rode like storm clouds, battering walls, chasing rebels, and sometimes stopping mid-siege to inspect how angry he looked in the process. Meanwhile, barons, already seasoned in chaos, learned to expect the unexpected. They adapted, hiding supplies, sending spies, and occasionally outmaneuvering the king's forces with plans that were equal parts genius and sheer luck. John's revenge wasn't subtle. He was loud, brash, and consumed by the thrill of asserting authority. But that very overkill revealed a key flaw. It spread his resources thin and made his actions predictable in their unpredictability. Every failed siege, botched ambush, or overextended march became a small victory for the rebels, who couldn't help but smirk at the absurdity of a king who treated every minor insult like a personal apocalypse. At the same time, the people living through it, peasants, merchants, and minor nobles, had front-row seats to a spectacle of power taken to extreme, often wondering whether they were part of history or just collateral in someone else's dramatic mood swings. Negotiations, when they occurred, were overshadowed by John's need to prove dominance. Letters arrived dripping with threats, promises, and the kind of dramatic phrasing that made later historians think he wrote them on a caffeine-fueled rant. Even as he raged, barons quietly coordinated their next moves, using his temper and overreaction against him, demonstrating that sometimes the best revenge is patience and tactical patience disguised as chaos. In hindsight, John's revenge tour looked less like an effective military campaign and more like someone swinging wildly at invisible enemies, occasionally hitting the right target, but mostly just making a mess. It set the stage for temporary truces, forced compromises, and an ongoing sense that in England, rebellion wasn't just possible, it was inevitable when the king had the emotional control of a storm cloud with a grudge. And so, the stage was set. Over-the-top fury met calculated defiance, producing a kind of absurd, chaotic equilibrium that would define the conflict for months to come. After months of dramatic fighting, siege mishaps, and letters dripping with passive aggression, a temporary peace emerged, though calling it peace was generous, because it lasted barely long enough for anyone to unpack their armor. The barons and King John agreed, reluctantly, and with plenty of eye-rolling, to pause hostilities, redraw boundaries, and pretend that trust was a thing that could exist between people who had spent the past year trying to destroy each other. Castles were refortified, armies disbanded, and negotiations were put on hold while both sides caught their breath, secretly checking over shoulders and sharpening daggers. The agreement had all the hallmarks of a band-aid slapped on a battlefield gash, ceremonial, slightly ridiculous, and entirely dependent on everyone behaving rationally, which, historically, was never guaranteed. Letters flew back and forth, each phrased to sound conciliatory, while simultaneously reminding the other side exactly how much trouble they could stir up if provoked. John, predictably, took the opportunity to remind everyone that he was still king and could be terrifyingly petty, while the barons quietly celebrated their tiny victories and catalogued all the ways the king had overreached. Rumors of betrayals circulated immediately, and minor skirmishes broke out because someone misread a signal or thought a neighbor's banner looked too threatening. In practical terms, the peace was a series of pauses. Armies went home, taxes were temporarily adjusted, and barons could sleep without worrying about an angry king crashing in at 3 a.m. But everyone knew it was fragile. Everyone, that is, except John, who acted like the agreement somehow validated his authority, completely missing the point that the barons were using it to regroup and plan their next move. Chronicles from the period reveal a mix of relief and exasperation. Barons relaxed just enough to plot quietly, while John simmered in his own melodrama, convinced that he could still bend everyone to his will with another surprise campaign or an especially scathing letter. Civilians, meanwhile, experienced peace like someone who had been riding a roller coaster blindfolded. They had time to repair homes, trade, and wonder if the world had momentarily stopped being absurd. Despite the thin veneer of civility, trust remained almost non-existent. Every handshake was a potential trap. Every toast at a feast a chance to poison the other guy's ambitions. And so, the temporary peace functioned as a weird, tense limbo, a pause button pressed with one hand while the other hand hovered over the chaos button. Historians sometimes marvel at how quickly it unraveled, but contemporaries probably just shrugged and muttered about kings, barons, and the predictability of human stubbornness. It was a moment that felt serious, calm, almost diplomatic, but anyone with experience in medieval politics knew better. It was a countdown to the next crisis, a lull in the storm where both sides pretended that compromise could exist in a world built on honor, ambition, and a generous helping of pettiness. And so England held its breath, waiting for the next eruption, knowing deep down that the fragile truce was merely a pause in a drama that had no intention of concluding quietly. When the dust finally settled, the rebellion had technically accomplished its goals. The barons had forced King John to acknowledge limits on his power. The Magna Carta had entered the history books, and England had learned, at least temporarily, that even a king could be called out. But, true to medieval form, the lessons weren't exactly internalized. John, as history would cruelly note, went right back to his usual antics whenever the opportunity presented itself, proving that grudges and temper are far more enduring than legal documents. The barons, for their part, celebrated victories while secretly plotting future skirmishes, alliances, and power grabs, because once you've tasted the thrill of successfully challenging a king, the next temptation is inevitable. Civilians probably shrugged and resumed their lives, still wary of who might be angry at whom, while historians later swooned over dramatic speeches, legal innovations, and absurd anecdotes, forgetting that most people at the time were just trying to survive another winter without being taxed into starvation. The rebellion also revealed the weird flexibility of power. Armies could be raised in a week, letters could wield more authority than swords, and threats could achieve more than actual fighting, provided everyone played the medieval game with enough subtlety and timing. Yet the human elements, vanity, stubbornness, pettiness, and that irresistible thrill of defiance proved eternal. Over the next decades, England would see the Magna Carta annulled, reissued, ignored, and celebrated, but the core lesson remained clear. Laws only matter if enough people enforce them, and kings only respect limits when someone has the courage and the audacity to demand it. Looking back, the rebellion was less about a tidy resolution and more about the spectacle of human ambition colliding with authority, producing absurd moments, unexpected alliances, and drama that even Shakespeare would have envied. Chroniclers immortalized barons' names, castles' walls, and the king's temper tantrums, often seasoning the narrative with snarky commentary that suggested medieval humor was alive and well, even if slightly tragic. In the end, history, as it tends to do, laughed quietly at the whole affair. A king who couldn't control himself, nobles who couldn't resist testing him, and a population caught in between, learning the hard way that power, patience, and sarcasm coexist in uncomfortable harmony. Lessons were technically present, but human nature remained stubbornly unchanged. Ambition, pride, and petty grudges ensured that the cycle of tension, negotiation, and rebellion would continue, because the personalities involved were simply too dramatic for a one-time solution. And so the rebellion closed its chapter in history, leaving behind chronicles filled with absurdities, heroic moments, and the kind of chaotic charm that made England's medieval period endlessly fascinating. People would remember the Baron's courage, John's temper, and the Magna Carta's significance, but they would also smirk at the endless cycle of promises, betrayals, and the reality that no lesson, no matter how clear, could truly tame the unpredictable mix of power and human ego. History had delivered its moral, wrapped in drama, snark, and swords, but everyone knew that next time the chaos would return, spectacularly and inevitably. From the moment Thomas Becket swaggered into King Henry II's inner circle, it was clear this friendship was going to be one of those epic, too-good-to-last stories. Henry, freshly crowned and full of that unearned confidence only kings can muster, saw in Becket not just a capable lawyer, but a wingman for all his royal schemes, the perfect mix of brains and charm. They drank, joked, and plotted policies like it was some medieval frat house, and honestly, everyone at court low-key envied the bromance. But then, in a plot twist that makes modern office politics look like child's play, Becket got crowned Archbishop of Canterbury, which was basically the medieval equivalent of getting promoted to CEO of God Inc. And suddenly, his loyalty shifted from the crown to the church, because, oaths and conscience and all that serious adult stuff. Henry was not subtle about his disappointment, and Becket, now wearing that heavy gold cross and probably regretting every time he said yes to a royal favor, started enforcing church law like it was a new TikTok challenge, which meant taxes, clergy privileges, and disputes over who actually ran the kingdom got super messy, super fast. Their meetings, once filled with laughter and casual insults, turned into awkward stare-downs, passive-aggressive commentaries on medieval fashion, and dramatic sighing that could have been subtitled like a soap opera. Courtiers began to whisper that the king and his former bestie were on a collision course, but of course, gossip spread slower than a letter delivered by a tired horse, so it was all very tense, yet somehow still kind of hilarious if you liked watching grown men argue over who could summon more spiritual authority. Meanwhile, Becket wasn't trying to pick a fight. He genuinely believed in his spiritual duties, but his strict enforcement of church rites clashed with Henry's do whatever I say because crown energy, and suddenly everyone had to pick sides. The absurdity wasn't lost on the monks and minor nobles watching two of the most powerful dudes in England bicker like roommates fighting over rent, except the stakes were souls and political power, not a broken toaster. Friends became enemies with the kind of dramatic flair only medieval Europe could produce, and neither Henry nor Becket seemed capable of backing down, partly pride, partly stubbornness, partly because neither really understood the other anymore. And so, what began as a story of camaraderie morphed into a simmering feud, one fueled by honor, sarcasm, and a dash of tragic inevitability that would echo through the halls of Canterbury and eventually, make history's highlight reels. The stage was set, tension mounting like an ominous soundtrack as England braced itself for the drama that was about to turn deadly, proving once and for all that friendship in the Middle Ages was basically a high-risk investment. Once Thomas Becket officially donned the Archbishop's robes, it was like watching someone step onto a stage wearing both a crown and a "Don't mess with me" sign. Those fancy hats, gilded crosses, and ridiculous rings weren't just accessories. They were medieval power armor, and Becket wore them like he was walking a runway in Paris, except the runway had swords and angry nobles lurking on the sidelines. Clergy and royal officials immediately sensed a shift. Becket wasn't just the king's buddy anymore. He was a walking, talking institution with a reputation for taking his duties way too seriously. Henry probably thought he was still dealing with the same guy who laughed at his bad jokes and ignored tax issues for a chuckle. But nope, Becket started showing up to court with the kind of intensity that made everyone else second-guess their life choices. Suddenly, disputes over church lands, trial rights, and clerical immunity became his new obsession, and any attempt by the crown to push back was met with icy stares that could curdle milk. Henry, who thought he could still flex his kingly muscles, realized that archbishops apparently had veto power over his mood swings, and Becket wielded it like a pro. The absurdity of this power struggle wasn't just political, it was personal. Former friends began whispering in corners, monks smirked behind their hands, and nobles tried to decode every tiny expression on Becket's face like it was stock market news. There were moments when Becket seemed almost theatrically petty, refusing to attend royal banquets, excommunicating minor annoyances, and generally acting like the ultimate "I do what I want" influencer of the 12th century. And yet, beneath the sarcasm and drama, he genuinely believed he was defending divine law, which, to him, was more binding than a king's tweet, or, in his era, royal decree. Meanwhile, Henry tried subtle manipulations that mostly ended up looking like high school passive aggression, sending letters with extra emphasis, hinting at consequences, and occasionally muttering curses under his breath that no one could verify. Becket, of course, interpreted these as tiny victories, raising the stakes further. It was basically a medieval version of a standoff in a reality show. Everyone knew disaster was coming, but no one wanted to admit it first. Courtiers placed bets, chroniclers scribbled scandalous notes, and the kingdom collectively held its breath as the former bros turned bitter rivals danced around each other, wielding both sarcasm and spiritual authority with reckless abandon. In the end, the absurdity of the whole scenario lay in its relatability. Two people once tight as thieves, now locked in a feud, each convinced they were morally untouchable, and everyone else stuck in the uncomfortable middle, knowing full well that history was about to clap back hard, probably with some swords and dramatic cathedral doors. Back in the royal court, the tension between Henry and Becket hit peak sitcom levels, except instead of witty punchlines, there were legal arguments and the occasional existential threat. Henry, frustrated that his former right-hand man had turned into the kingdom's ultimate "not today, sir" authority, started dropping hints, the classic kingly subtleties, about how maybe the archbishop should chill a little. He didn't exactly say, "Take a hike, Thomas," but his passive-aggressive remarks were basically medieval subtweets, and everyone got the memo. Becket, on the other hand, wasn't having it. Every sarcastic comment, every thinly veiled royal jab, he countered with a mix of holy righteousness and eyebrow raises so sharp they could pierce armor. Witnesses later swore the tension was palpable. Some monks described it as watching two bulls butt heads in velvet cloaks, which is honestly not far off. What made it extra spicy was that both men knew they had power, Henry with armies and titles, Becket with moral authority and a knack for making everyone feel guilty about stuff no one even knew was sinful. The petty feuding escalated to ridiculous lengths. There were arguments over mundane things like who could tax the clergy, whether priests could be tried in royal courts, and even whose ceremonial chair was more appropriate for state events. Chroniclers probably had a field day with this because it read like the medieval equivalent of a Twitter roast battle. The absurdity wasn't just in the disagreement, but in the personalities. Henry, who expected obedience, was confronted by Becket, who now operated on a moral Wi-Fi the king couldn't jam. Meanwhile, the court was caught in the crossfire, awkwardly laughing at jokes that were only half funny and panicking whenever anyone mentioned excommunication or fines. Knights rolled eyes, clerics whispered about impending doom, and everyone was low-key waiting for the drama to tip over into actual violence, which, spoiler alert, it eventually did. Even minor incidents, like Becket refusing to attend royal dinners or challenging a low-level tax collector, were reported with the kind of juicy detail that made them feel like scandalous reality TV moments. Henry's frustration grew until he muttered some words, probably along the lines of, "Will no one rid me of this troublesome priest?" And if the historical record is to be trusted, the universe heard him way too literally. It was a perfect storm of sarcasm, pride, and misunderstood orders, showing how even in the 12th century, office politics could end very, very badly. What started as a friendship-turned-feud was spiraling into something far more dangerous, a tense prelude that made everyone realize that Becket's blend of holiness, stubbornness, and sarcastic resistance was a recipe for chaos Henry himself couldn't control. Watching it unfold, the kingdom was basically binge-watching the most dramatic medieval series ever, popcorn optional, swords mandatory. When Becket finally fled to France, it wasn't exactly the dark, miserable exile people imagine. Think more awkward luxury Airbnb meets political asylum, with just a dash of forced humility. He landed in the court of King Louis VII, who was equal parts supportive and amused, like, "Oh, England again. That's messy, isn't it?" Becket's life abroad was a strange cocktail of prayer, politicking, and low-key complaining about missing his favorite cathedral furniture. Letters flew back and forth between him and Henry, some polite, some full-blown, passive-aggressive flexes, and all of them dripping with the kind of sarcasm only centuries of ecclesiastical education can produce. Becket made the most of his forced stay, rubbing elbows with French nobles, attending ceremonies, and making subtle hints about moral superiority that probably made everyone slightly uncomfortable. Yet he also faced practical annoyances, housing arrangements that didn't respect his archbishop's swagger, clergy who didn't get his exacting standards, and of course, the constant existential dread of knowing his old friend turned foe was still plotting from across the channel. He wrote letters with veiled humor, occasionally bragging about French wine or the size of the royal libraries, and Henry, being Henry, replied with curt words that basically translated to, "Don't test me, Thomas." The absurdity of it all was that this exile, while politically serious, looked like a medieval influencer retreating to a spa, all pomp and principle, waiting for the right moment to return. Courtiers in both kingdoms speculated endlessly, their gossip a mix of fear and fascination, because Becket's absence somehow made his moral authority even more dramatic. Being physically out of England didn't mean he wasn't still shaping laws, irritating officials, and making Henry look impotent in front of the nobility. It was like watching a slow-motion chess match, where one player had the power of armies, and the other had the power of guilt, conscience, and impeccable timing. While Henry tried to assert dominance at home, Becket gathered sympathy, proving that exile could be a political superpower if wielded correctly. Meanwhile, chroniclers couldn't get enough. Their stories of Becket walking the French streets, scolding minor officials, and sipping wine while crafting letters that subtly shamed a king made for some of the best medieval tea ever spilled. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The man who had once been the king's right hand now ran circles of influence from abroad, his sarcasm sharper, his principles firmer, and his reputation growing to almost mythical levels. By the time the exiled archbishop plotted his eventual return, he had not only survived politically, but had turned absence into leverage, leaving Henry in a state of simmering irritation, public embarrassment, and the creeping realization that Becket was not just back in his head, but basically everywhere his conscience whispered. In the grand absurdity of medieval power games, exile wasn't a punishment. It was an upgrade, with scenic views and plenty of dramatic irony. Becket's return to England was less a quiet homecoming and more a theatrical entrance worthy of the kind of medieval Instagram he definitely would have curated if it existed. He stepped off the boat with the kind of confidence that made local peasants whisper, nobles clutch their robes, and Henry internally combust somewhere behind his royal curtain. The Archbishop's procession to Canterbury was long, deliberate, and meticulously dramatic, as if every footstep were a subtle clapback to the king's previous frustrations. Clergy lined the streets, fans in hand, waving banners like it was a festival, while Becket maintained an air of holy seriousness mixed with just a pinch of "I told you so." Henry, predictably, did not greet him with hugs or high fives. Instead, he fumed from his court, surrounded by advisors trying to decode whether Becket's calm expression meant peace or plotting. In truth, Becket was back not just to preach, but to reassert the power of the church, and he did so with a flair that bordered on dramatic performance art. Minor disputes erupted immediately. Knights accidentally bowed too low, tax collectors sneezed in the wrong direction, and Becket had a way of turning every minor offense into a subtle, cutting sermon that left witnesses both awed and slightly terrified. Chroniclers describe these moments with an almost comedic undertone, noting how the king's men scrambled to keep pace with the archbishop's moral authority while avoiding spiritual side-eyes that could ruin careers. And yet, beneath the ceremonial fanfare and sarcastic quips, there was genuine tension. Everyone knew this return carried the risk of explosive conflict. After all, past grievances don't disappear just because you cross a channel. Henry's irritation was palpable, not hidden behind subtlety this time, and he had to watch as Becket's influence spread faster than rumors of the king's temper ever could. The absurdity of the scenario was thick. A king used to absolute control suddenly realized that his former best friend could command the kingdom's conscience with a mere raised eyebrow and a carefully phrased homily. Becket walked through Canterbury like a man who knew every eye was on him, every whisper documented, every small nod or frown a minor battlefield. He re-established old alliances, reminded the clergy of their privileges, and subtly humiliated Henry's officials in ways that were as clever as they were uncomfortably theatrical. And all the while the kingdom braced for the inevitable, the moment when simmering frustrations and unspoken threats would collide in a way that no procession, no sermon, and no ornate robe could prevent. By the time Becket settled back into his archiepiscopal duties, England was holding its breath, half in awe, half in dread, fully aware that the drama wasn't over. It was only just beginning, and everyone was about to witness history's most polite yet deadly feud escalate into something no one could ignore. Medieval England had never felt so much like reality TV, with swords, sanctity, and sarcasm as the main plot points. The fateful day at Canterbury began like any other, or so the Archbishop and the kingdom's citizens might have hoped. But, as history likes to remind us, subtlety was not on anyone's side. 4 knights, fired up by what they claimed were Henry's muttered frustrations, rode into the cathedral with the kind of righteous confidence that only comes from confusing sarcasm with a literal marching order. These guys weren't villains in the classic sense. They were loyal, a little dim on nuance, and entirely convinced they were saving the king's honor while simultaneously boosting their own reputations. They burst into the hallowed halls like an ill-advised action sequence, swords gleaming and nerves jangling, and found Becket deep in ceremony, probably thinking about prayers, moral responsibility, and the kingdom's perpetual drama rather than anticipating death threats. The absurdity of it all was palpable. Medieval knights, trained in warfare, armed with both weapons and a questionable understanding of social cues, confronting an archbishop whose greatest combat experience was with excommunication letters and passive-aggressive sermons. Becket, faced with these intruders, didn't exactly beg for mercy. He tried negotiation, probably reasoned with them, maybe even sighed in a way that would make anyone reconsider their life choices. But the knights were on a mission, interpreting his moral outrage as theatrical stalling. Witnesses later recounted the scene with a mixture of horror and incredulous amusement, noting how Becket, despite his piety, moved with the sort of calm that made the violence even more absurdly shocking. Clergy and attendants scrambled in chaos, tripping over robes, dropping candles, and screaming in ways that made the cathedral echo like a medieval sound effects studio. The knights, caught between loyalty and panic, hesitated, then acted with the speed and brutality of men who thought they were fulfilling divine orders while utterly misunderstanding the subtlety of human communication. One swing of a sword, one misjudged step, and suddenly the sacred halls were drenched in a mixture of blood, fear, and utter disbelief. The grandeur of Canterbury Cathedral, usually a place of solemnity and awe, became a chaotic theater of panic, demonstrating that even sanctity could not protect against misinterpreted commands. Becket's final moments, as witnesses described, were a mix of defiance, resignation, and the sort of historical irony that makes you want to face palm through centuries. The man who had spent years enforcing church authority was felled not by armies or foreign invaders, but by overzealous domestic knights who mistook a king's frustration for a literal mandate. In retrospect, the event was as absurd as it was tragic. Miscommunication, sarcasm, and misaligned loyalties combined to produce a murder that would echo through history, turning a domestic feud into a story of shocking violence, political disaster, and the enduring reminder that medieval politics, like modern drama, often escalates far beyond anyone's original intentions. Chaos erupted in Canterbury Cathedral like someone had hit the medieval panic button. Blood pooled on the flagstones, incense smoke mingled with screams, and monks ducked behind pews like they were extras in some tragic stage production nobody auditioned for. Becket, struck down by the very knights who had sworn loyalty to the king, became an instant spectacle, heroic, tragic, and slightly surreal, like a character from a storybook that took a darkly comedic turn. Witnesses recalled the scene with a mix of horror and disbelief, noting that even in death, Becket maintained a dignity that made the violence around him look absurdly petty. The knights, now realizing they'd gone way beyond their intended drama, froze for a moment in the cathedral's glow, swords dripping, eyes wide, probably thinking, well, that escalated fast. Courtiers, clerics, and servants scrambled to contain the panic, some praying loudly, some fainting theatrically, and others trying to figure out how a simple miscommunication could spiral into literal murder. Meanwhile, news traveled faster than a royal messenger could gallop, with townspeople outside the cathedral gossiping, speculating, and fully embracing the chaotic absurdity of the situation. Henry II, upon hearing the news, reportedly went through every stage of denial, anger, and regret, ultimately realizing that sarcastic muttering about getting rid of this troublesome priest might have been taken too literally. Chroniclers naturally had a field day, turning the event into a story full of moral lessons, drama, and ironic commentary, ensuring that generations would read about it with a mix of awe and facepalms. The cathedral itself, once a serene space for worship and reflection, had become a stage for one of history's most dramatic deaths, complete with unintended actors and a plot twist nobody anticipated. Becket's body, revered instantly, transformed the tragedy into myth, as if the universe itself wanted to underline the absurdity of human miscommunication, combined with extreme loyalty and misplaced zeal. Pilgrims soon arrived, some genuinely grieving, others curious, all drawn by the mix of sanctity, scandal, and and spectacle, proving that nothing spreads faster than gossip wrapped in blood and drama. And while the immediate aftermath was chaotic, what truly cemented the story in history's annals was the mixture of horror, irony, and sheer human absurdity. 4 knights, a king's careless words, and an archbishop who refused to compromise had inadvertently created a legend. Canterbury Cathedral, stained by the events, would never be the same, becoming both a pilgrimage site and a reminder of how power, pride, and misinterpretation can collide in spectacularly deadly ways. The moral, if one could distill it, was as timeless as it was brutal. Never underestimate the consequences when sarcasm, miscommunication, and medieval weapons converge in a sacred space. In the aftermath of Becket's assassination, England was a kingdom buzzing with panic, gossip, and the kind of dramatic overreactions that would make modern social media look tame. Henry II, once smug in his royal authority, suddenly had to navigate a political nightmare, public outrage, moral condemnation, and the very real possibility of excommunication, all while trying to convince the world he hadn't actually ordered a murder. Chroniclers painted him as a king caught between guilt, ego, and PR disaster management, scribbling accounts with a mixture of sarcasm, moralizing, and shock that made the story practically go viral in parchment form. Becket, meanwhile, posthumously rose from a controversial figure to a martyr, his blood-stained robes becoming relics, his death inspiring pilgrimages, sermons, and the kind of legend that turns ordinary humans into saints overnight. The knights, the poor overachievers of literal loyalty, faced punishment and infamy, and their misinterpretation of royal frustration became a cautionary tale about the dangers of literal-minded zeal in a world fueled by honor and pride. Henry, recognizing both the political necessity and the moral horror, performed public penance, kneeling before Becket's tomb, whipping himself in front of clergy and citizens alike, which, from a modern perspective, was both awkward and oddly theatrical, like a royal apology tour before such things existed. Meanwhile, news spread across Europe, spreading outrage and fascination in equal measure, and the story became shorthand for "Don't let sarcasm be taken literally," albeit on a much higher stakes scale. Becket's canonization followed quickly, cementing his place in history and ensuring that his name would echo far beyond the walls of Canterbury, in sermons, chronicles, and the whispered commentary of curious minds everywhere. Over time, the events were retold with a mix of reverence and humor, highlighting not just the tragedy, but the absurdity of a feud escalating to murder, fueled by pride, miscommunication, and dramatic personalities clashing in the most public way possible. The moralistic undertones didn't dampen the gossip. If anything, they amplified it, and the story of Thomas Becket became a legend not just of martyrdom, but of human folly, where even kings and knights could be undone by impatience, misinterpretation, and a friend gone morally rogue. Pilgrims continued to visit Canterbury. Historians chronicled the incident with endless fascination, and the tale morphed into a cautionary epic of medieval drama, divine consequence, and yes, the eternal, slightly sarcastic reminder that friendship, loyalty, and power can collide in ways no one, no matter how pious or powerful, can fully control. It was history at its most theatrical, tragic, and absurdly human, leaving a legacy that continues to inspire awe, disbelief, and a subtle grin at the sheer chaos of it all. And so, Thomas Becket's death became not only a turning point in the church-state power struggle, but a story immortalized as part tragedy, part reality TV, and all human, reminding everyone that even saints are not immune to the perils of miscommunication and ambition.